morning session where we heard from members of Congress, activists from across the country, talking about how we achieve a ceasefire in Gaza. Now, brothers and sisters, in all the great religious texts, they tell us to have faith in God. And they tell us to believe in peacemaking. But they also tell us that there has to be an element of activism. There has to be a connection that is made. In Ephesians, it tells us, right, that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. We wrestle against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness in this world. Well, the way that we wrestle with that is by organizing, by getting our voices heard in Washington, D.C. to say that the violence in the Middle East must stop. There must be a ceasefire in Gaza. The hostages must be freed. The prisoners must be returned. And we must begin a genuine peace process. So we are joined today by a remarkable panel of people, many of whom you've heard a little bit of, but today, at this moment, we're going to focus in on Washington, D.C. and how to make things happen there. We have with us Congressman Jonathon Jackson, one of the first signers of the ceasefire resolution. Ariel from the Fellowship of Reconciliation, who has been one of the key organizers of this conference. And the one guy you all know, James Zogby, AAI, the poll, everything that's been going on. So let's sit down and get started. We don't have a lot of time, so let's do this quick and smart. James Zogby, in 1976, you testified before a panel on which Senator Joe Biden, a first-term senator, was considering issues of the Middle East, considering issues of Israel and Palestine. Has he moved at all since 1976?
You know, it was remarkable. It was remarkable when I reflected on it and went back and found the transcript of my testimony and his questioning, that his brain got locked in the 70s and never moved on this issue and on many others. And I read an article in Mother Jones just recently about how one of his early mentors was Scoop Jackson, who one might say his office was the breeding place for the neoconservative movement. A lot of Democrats who were liberal on social issues but became Cold War hawks and very pro-Israel. Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, Doug Feith, a lot of these guys grew up in that environment. And Joe Biden, that was his mentor when he first got in the Senate. And I didn't make that connection until I read the article, and then I went back and looked at the testimony and his reaction to it. And I saw that that's where he was back then, and I've had conversations with him since, and he hasn't moved a bit. The question is, how do we move Congress? There are people we cannot move. Yeah, sure.
You say the question is, how do we move Congress?
You're going to drive me bonkers.
We want to move Congress because we want to move Joe Biden, right? Ultimately, that's obviously, if Congress were to hold back money, that would be essential. But at the heart of it, the more energy there is in Congress, the more likely it is that we have an impact on the White House, because this is, in fact, politics, whether we like it or not. And so let me ask you one more thing on Biden before we move to some of these congressional issues and the activism. And that is, Joe Biden is perhaps locked in a mindset of the past. He has people around him, however, and I'm wondering, it's clear aides in the White House, young aides in the White House have signed letters, people at the State Department have signed letters. Is the challenge that the president is not listening to anyone but a small circle, or what do you think is going on there?
I think the dynamic works the other way. It's not that he's not listening, it's that they're not asking. The classic Washington syndrome or mindset is you don't question the boss because you lose access if you do. So they go along, get along to go along, whatever the expression is, because they don't want to lose their parking place. They don't want to lose their seat at the lunch table. They don't want to lose their opportunity to meet in the Oval Office. So they, yes, boss, whatever you say, boss. I think that's more the dynamic. But at the end of the day, Joe Biden is also a political creature. And when you think back to 2020 and the issues that he picked up from Bernie Sanders, because he knew he needed that wing, and he had to adopt that agenda, he did. The question is, move enough members of Congress, show him, as we showed in our poll, where public opinion is on this issue, and that his entire reelection and legacy will be shaped by losing an election based on Gaza, which could very well be the case. I think we could see movement.
One more thing I'm going to ask you before I turn to the congressman here, and that is, we started by mentioning the president, right? Because this is a panel discussion about D.C. and about politics. But we should also kind of have that bigger global picture. In your view, as somebody who's dealt with the Middle East for a very, very long time, who's polled in the region, who's polled here in the States, who's followed, is there any chance that Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel moves unless President Biden and the U.S. moves?
No, there is not. And
yeah, Beanie.
I think we've seen, there actually was a very strong pro-Israel thought leader here in the U.S. who wrote a piece in Orbis magazine back in the 90s about how the only way you move Israel is through pressure from America. And he went back to Gerald Ford, he went to Ronald Reagan, he went to Jimmy Carter, he went to all the presidents who used pressure. Even Ronald Reagan, 1982, after Begin was assaulting Lebanon, at one point called him on the phone and said, people are watching this, it is a Holocaust, stop. And then he suspended F-16s, he suspended cluster bombs, and guess what? Begin stopped. I mean, I never thought I'd be at the point where I'd say a Democratic president needed to learn a lesson from Ronald Reagan, but that was the situation. And the fact is that he has been an enabler, whereas some other presidents have used even limited pressure. Bill Clinton said, I'll never publicly pressure the Israelis, but he used the most subtle and careful ways of applying pressure. Like, he was in LA, his plane right next to Netanyahu's on the runway, and Netanyahu sent a message over he wanted to talk to him, and Clinton said, I have no time, and wouldn't talk to him. And meanwhile, got a haircut, and then flew back to Washington, held a dinner for Shimon Peres, giving him something that had never existed before, the Yitzhak Rabin Peace Award, and invited 75 Arab and 75 Jewish leaders, and spoke glowingly about Peres, who, oh, by the way, was running an election against Netanyahu at the time. And Netanyahu got the message. You don't screw with the President of the United States. And so the point is that the message he's getting from Joe Biden is, I can screw with him all I want. He's not going to do anything. And so if you send the message with pressure, Israel gets nervous. And they have no reason to get nervous right now because there's no pressure.
Last thing on that before I shift. I know I said that was the last, but one more little element here. People need to remember that George H.W. Bush and James Baker, another set of Republicans, moved a lot of ground on this issue by talking about loan guarantees.
Completely. There would not have been a Madrid peace conference had Jim Baker not applied that kind of pressure. And granted, I mean, my big gripe with Jim Baker was the pressure was brilliant, but the goal he set was too limited. The goal he set was to just get him at the table. The goal should have been to get him to complete a deal. When you spend all your energy, all your political capital, all your weapons on simply getting them to the table, you then don't have anything left for when it comes time to use it for the big stuff. But frankly, if we threatened sanctions, if we threatened cut in aid, if we threatened what we could threaten, right, you would see movement in Israel. Here, let me just make one final point and then I'll stop. The issue for me is not only do we enable Israel and allow them to do horrible things against Palestinians, we have killed the peace movement in Israel that was vibrant back in the 90s, because they have given up because America has not had their back. They'll not have their back. And so if you pressure Israel, you not only get them to move, but you also empower the Israeli people to challenge their own government, not on the who gets to pray at the wall, not who gets to determine marriage laws, but on who gets to determine whether or not they will live in a constant state of war and apartheid against Palestinians. That would make a difference. It would empower peace in Israel, and it would also send a message to Palestinians that maybe America could have our back. But right now, Palestinians feel America has no hope, and Israelis feel America's got no clout. And so you got the spoiled child going after the abused child, and you get what you get, which is genocide.
James Zogby. Congressman Jackson, you grew up with these issues. Your father, in 1979, started talking about some of these issues, and by the time '84 came around, he was talking about it more. And '88 actually forced the convention dialogue on Israel-Palestine. So you came to Congress with a knowledge of this. Not all of your fellow members are of the same experience and necessarily have seen the politics of it with the wholeness that you have. I was struck that in the immediate aftermath of the horrific Hamas attack on October 7th, that you were one of the very first people to speak up and to say the attack was horrific, but we have to make sure that the steps that are taken forward are not in themselves horrific. Obviously, not all members have done that. Members are now starting to evolve. We hear that there's about 57 to 60 members who have called for ceasefire in some way or another. That's in the House. There are 4 senators. Tell me about your own kind of experience of this, and also how you think it might be possible to move more members of the House on the theory that obviously if they move, that may move the White House as well.
Well, thank you so much. I'd like to affiliate myself with everything that Uncle Jim Zogby has said, spot on. I hadn't heard the spoiled child and the abused child analogy, but very appropriate. Here we are. So in 1979, I was in 7th grade. I wasn't watching the news that much, probably more football and basketball at the time, but was able to vote in 1984 for the first time when my father was running. 1983, I believe, when he went to Damascus, Syria, to meet with President Hafez Assad, who the United States was not talking to. At that time, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld had gone back and forth to Syria and was never asked about a downed fighter pilot and Captain Lieutenant Robert Goodman. My father asked to speak with the ambassador to Syria, asked to meet with the president, Hafez Assad, accommodated us. We went over there with an ecumenical group, ministers, Baptists, rabbis, and imams, people from different faiths, to seek a meeting, A, with the ecumenical council, and B, with the president. Religion moves.
Many of them from Chicago, right? People that the Reverend had worked with here on the ground. So you bring in domestic activism, flying over to do global things.
And so it's important to understand religion has a place. If you want to move their government, you have to talk to their religious leaders. All the power is not vested in their government to government. There is a role for the activists here and the people that are of the faith community to play a role in this peace process. It does matter in many other parts of the world. So without the portfolio of the United States government, without a senior chairman of a committee, without a ranking member, without portfolio of the United States government, just an African-American minister with other people of the faith community was able to go over and secure the release of Lieutenant Robert Goodman that the people in our own government had never asked to be released. That's one. Second part, when the Gulf Wars were about to begin, if you will, the war with Iraq, and that time, Secretary of State Colin Powell, some would say he was misled, some would say that he finally testified. Unfortunately, I'd have to say, even in his death, that Secretary of State Colin Powell lied. If people give you the bad information and you're willing to put your credibility on the line and it leads to hundreds of thousands of people getting killed, that is a lie. And I'm only saying that on the principle of the position he was in. If everyone around you told you that, and you ended up giving it, and it led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. $6 trillion the United States has subsequently put into Iraq. $2 trillion we have since put into Afghanistan. We went to Iraq, same formula, went to meet with the Ecumenical Peace Council, the Ecumenical Group, then went to meet with President Saddam Hussein, went behind the Green Wall, went to the palace. My father asked about the release of 400 persons then that were human shields, to ask them to be released in order to avert the war that was imminent because they said they were stealing oil. There's a symmetry and there's a continuity on how time is repeating itself again. And then ultimately they hung Saddam Hussein, killed him, killed his children, and Iraq became destabilized. Iranian influence has now since grown over the mountain because of the destabilization and 1 million people killed. In conclusion, I have seen the peace process work, and I knew it wasn't going to be weaponizing people that had anger and vengeance and revenge in their heart. And on that day of October 7th, there were 1,127, I believe, Jewish brothers and sisters that had been horrifically killed. There had been over 1,400 brothers and sisters of Palestinian descent that were killed, if I'm not wrong, on October 7th. And knowing this being in the hands of Mr. Netanyahu, that he would absolutely go beyond any conventional understanding of traditional warfare. And now, 90 days later, we're looking at closer to 30,000 people having been killed, over 100,000 people crippled and maimed, and the United States is not able to rein him in. In these events of war, you have to act on caution. Let more peace and more conversation lead. Don't make decisions when you're angry. Don't make promises when you're happy, and don't write letters when you're angry. I've learned about that from being in office. And it was an easy decision. Ceasefire now so that people can be reconciled and get back to the table. When you know that 50% of the population in Gaza is under the age of 18, when you realize that over 50% are women, over 50% are children, essentially, and the population is women and children, you can't kill the person that's being held hostage, if you will, by Hamas, saying you're going after the hostage taker. It made no sense on the face. I wanted to see Israeli and Palestinian children have a future together, not a future generation of orphaned Palestinian children wanting to seek revenge after Netanyahu's continued assault on the Gaza Strip. So it was a straightforward solution for me to seek peace. It wasn't popular then, but I didn't want it to be popular. I wanted to be morally correct. I wanted my children to look me in the eye and say, "Dad, job well done." I wanted my father to look me in the eye and say, "Job well done." I wanted to come back to Chicago to my constituents and having represented you in the manner that you found to be most suitable and honest with the most integrity for you too. That's my campaign plug as well.
Let me ask you, you talk to your colleagues. In fact, it's funny, before you went to Congress, you and I talked a little bit, and one of the things you said was, I'm going to go and talk to Republicans. I'm going to go across that aisle, I'm going to find people I disagree with, and I'm going to start my conversations with them because I want to build relationships, and I know you've done a lot of that. As you talk to your colleagues now, not to the ones who've signed on to ceasefire, but to the ones who might sign on, or who you would hope would, where does it stand today? Are there more members who are looking at this, and what might move them to sign on for a ceasefire?
You know, I would say, in fairness to some of my colleagues, I've had the incredible fortune, if you will, of growing up under Mr. Jim Zogby and calling him Uncle Jim. This goes back to the 70s, and when Arab Americans weren't even included in the United States Census. The first Arab American was recorded in the United States Census in the year 2000. So if you want to look at American history, there are no Arab Americans even recorded here until technically you have the United States Census to make it a classification. So you've always been here and have not been recognized. Many of my colleagues, we can come, and that's the beauty of the institution. You could have been an insurance salesman, you could have worked in a bar, you could have been a university professor, you could have been a wealthy person. We all have to get on the ballot the same way, the same time. It's the only branch of government where you cannot be appointed is into the House of Representatives. And I've had the opportunity to grow up here at Rainbow Push under the leadership of my father, Reverend Jackson, and meet these heads of states before I got there. I've already met the popes before. I've already met kings before. I've already met heads of states before. I've already seen a peace process work before. So in some ways, the ranking member, Gregory Meeks of Foreign Affairs, sometimes he looks at me and smiles and shakes his head and says, "You're not a freshman." And so in many ways, I've been around the other side, the activist community. And so now being on the inside, some of the votes you won't necessarily understand because you have to go deep into all of the language. And I say you won't understand just because of the time we have to commit. But some of these are gotcha votes, where people are trying to frame you to look anti-Semitic because there was one word in the legislation that you disagreed with, so you voted against it. We weren't anti-Semitic or anti-Israel. We were just anti-Benjamin Netanyahu and his tactics on what he's doing. So there are many good people in Israel that want to see it stop. I wanted to first side on the side of peace and reconciliation. I wanted to side thinking about the future of Palestinian and Israeli children living together long after I'm gone, long after this room is empty, not creating a future generation of enemies with hostilities and animosity. And unfortunately, Mr. Netanyahu on this destructive path is creating another generation. And he won't be able to build a wall big enough. He won't be able to have a moat wide enough. He won't be able to be armed enough to stop all the anger that is now being created. So we ask for peace and ceasefire and reconciliation so there can be a future generation that can study war no more in that area. And I have to say a very special thank you, if you will, to the Qatari government. The Qatari government is leading the peace process. Now, what's wrong with that picture? That's a great thing that they have emerged this nation and they're leading the peace process. Why isn't the United States leading the peace process? That's what I want to see happen going forward immediately.
Congressman Jonathon Jackson. So, Ariel Gold, you're an activist. I mean, that's just the truth of it. You happen to head an organization, which has been around since 1915, doing incredible work on behalf of peace and justice, but you are an activist. So you have just heard one of the smartest people about the Middle East that you know, and somebody who's talked to the president and been around doing this for decades, Jim Zogby, say, I don't know if the guy's gonna move very easily. You've just heard a Congressman who's had an awful lot of experience saying, look, we know what we should do, but boy, it's hard to get them there, right? You got 57, but you don't have 218. What needs to happen now? What do people need to do to move Washington? I know our passion and our pain as regards what's happening in the Middle East. We need to talk about it. We need to process all that. But from an activist standpoint, what has to happen?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to say that activists have been doing an incredible job since this started, have been filling the streets, have been filling the jails, and that's what we do as activists. And it's not just about ramping it up, but it's also about how we can own and refine the message. And one of the things that, let's say the right or the pro-war folks are sometimes good at is dividing us. And they've been attempting to own the faith community at large. And right after October 7th, the day after, and all through the month of October, evangelical pro-Christian movements, Christian United for Israel, they raised millions, and they advocated on behalf of Israel for that, and they attempted in many ways owned that narrative. And we, as people of faith, this is actually our narrative, because we know that the teachings of all of our faiths are for peace and justice, and to suggest that supporting a war would be what God would want is, in a word, perverse. So what does that look like for us to do? And, I've been watching in a lot of ways how the right has attempted to own various parts of this issue, from the religious angle, saying, that God, the land of Israel was promised to the Jews, or the evangelicals, need this war to take place, or the idea that when we go out in the streets and when Rabbis for Ceasefire and Jews for Ceasefire, Jewish Voice for Peace, if not now, some of our own Jewish organizations then label that as pro-Hamas, label that as not caring about the Israeli women who were brutally raped on October 7th, label that as one-sided against the Jewish people. And that's just not true. I label that as, well, we have this division about who is for release of the hostages, and that either you want a ceasefire or you want the hostages released. And yet we know that the only time the people taken hostage on October 7th were released was when there was a halt in the bombings and the war. And so these are actually our allies. And I agree with Representative Jackson that faith has a voice. It has a voice in having an influence, and it has a voice in Congress. And we need to be working not just in the streets, but in our houses of worship. And that work is being done. There's a full-page ad in Atlanta newspaper today of Black faith leaders for ceasefire. And of course, we see this with Rabbis for Ceasefire, who are continuously in handcuffs. And we need to build this up. And there's great organizations in the evangelical community working on this. And so it's up to us to reclaim the name of God as one of justice and peace, and to take advantage of moments that occur, which we saw during Christmas when Reverend Munther in Bethlehem placed baby Jesus amid the rubble, and it went viral. So how do we take that moment as people of faith and lift that up and be a prophetic voice for the reality, which is that, for people of the Abrahamic faith, these are the times that define us, right? This is it, and our liberation is linked with each other, and so we have to unite in that same way.
Let me follow up on one aspect of that, and that is, if I'm hearing you right, what you are saying is that you may not be able to counter all of the political influence, right, and all the politics here, but members of Congress actually represent districts, right? And there are 600,000-700,000 people living in, maybe 800,000 living in a district, and an awful lot of those are people of faith. And so at the end of the day, one of the most effective ways to build out a constituency in the district of each individual member of Congress is to take that time and build out those faith coalitions. It's not the only answer. There are many, many other things that have to be done. But building out Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, non-believers who may still have some sympathy into a message, that's powerful, isn't it? That is something, and maybe hopeful as well, because we've seen it around the country. I come from Wisconsin, and Senator Tammy Baldwin was, had not taken a strong stand, and then Mennonite Action, and the Mennonites are not the biggest religion in America, Mennonite Action had a protest at her office, and the next day she made a very powerful statement on concern about the violence in Gaza. And so it seems like this can actually move people.
Absolutely, this can move people, and houses of worship have a lot of influence in districts, and we've seen houses of worship move communities on issues of racial justice, on LGBTQ plus rights, and we need to be clear as we stand against Christian nationalism here and Hindu nationalism in India and Jewish supremacy in Israel, that our faiths know for certain that killing children is not what we are called to do. And we need to put that loud and clear and front and center and be houses of worship, organize as houses of worship for ceasefire, houses of worship against white supremacy. These are all things that are linked together. And, you know, sometimes we think of prayer as very separate. And, so Rabbi Joshua Heschel, after he marched with Dr. King from Selma to Montgomery, he said somebody had asked him, well, did you have time to pray? And he said, I felt like my legs were praying. And we have to realize that our prayers are manifested through actions. And so, you know, as today is the holy day of Shabbat, it is being here, or it is being out in the streets, that is how we pray right now.
So we are told that we probably shouldn't around the dinner table mention religion and politics. But it sounds, Ariel Gold, like you were telling us that we ought to start with religion and politics. Ariel Gold. Jim Zogby, you had something you wanted to add here.
Yeah, two things. One on this session and one on something I've been thinking about and didn't mention before. On this session, we have elections in November. We have a number of members who are fantastic colleagues of yours who are being threatened because they have spoken out on these issues. They're being challenged. We cannot afford to lose a single one of them. If you want to make change in Congress, we've got to show other members of Congress that they can speak out and face the huge amounts of money and still win elections. We need Jamal Bowman and Summer Lee and the rest of them, Rashida and Ilhan and Corey. We need them in Congress. We have to defend them. That's number one. Number two, this is a message for all of us. If you listen to the speeches today and yesterday of the people we really respect, the Reverend Bryants and the Reverend Haynes and the congressman who spoke and what Ariel and others who had this message. Our message has got to be inclusive. It cannot be angry. It cannot be judgment. If we say, if you're not with us, you're the enemy, and you are this and you're that, we're turning people. Our message has to be inviting to people. It has to bring them, as Dr. King, as Reverend Jackson did. I was thinking, there are people who compare Jesse Jackson to other people. There has not been somebody running for president yet, including now, and I mean this in all seriousness, and I respect all of them who've done it, who has had the kind of message that Reverend Jackson did. He lifted us to a higher plane. He took the message of Dr. King, made it a political message, and brought people together around. You could oppose him, but not oppose his message. As he said, I could be an imperfect messenger, but my message is perfect. Stay with me. God's not done with me yet. That is so important. So temper your language. Don't turn people off. My mom used to say, think about what other people are hearing when you talk. If they see you as angry and threatening and not inviting, they're not going to be with us. That's it.
James Zogby. We got about a minute left because we're really trying to stick to a schedule today. And actually, for people who are watching, you get to munch on your potato chips as you watch, but or pita chips perhaps. But some of these folks have a lunch coming up. So, but before we do that, I want to first turn to Ariel. I'm going to let Jim's words be his brilliant conclusion, as always. Turn to Ariel. If there's one thing that people can do, you've talked about a lot of big stuff. If there's one thing people can do coming out of this room today and watching out around the country, what is it?
Organize. So whether that's in your city council to pass a resolution for ceasefire, whether that's in your church, your mosque, or your synagogue to get your house of worship to come out for ceasefire, whether that's in your community center, organize.
Ariel Gold. Congressman, you're going back to Washington, and I know on Tuesday over in the Senate, Bernie Sanders is going to try and raise some of the funding issues with the resolution there. What are you going to do in Washington this week to try and move this issue? You've just been with all these incredible people. You bring your own knowledge of your experience, but you also bring the passion that you've had in this room. What are you going to take back to Washington?
If I can have this privilege to make one comment. First, we need to thank Senator Dick Durbin. He's the first United States senator to sign on for ceasefire. There are 435 of us in the Congress, but there's 100 in the Senate, and our own Illinois Senator Dick Durbin was the first U.S. senator, and then 3 others quickly followed behind him. So congratulations. Thank you for that leadership, Dick Durbin. The second part, on way of background, on October 7th of 2023, the United States did not have an ambassador sworn in from the United States to Israel or an ambassador sworn in from the United States to Egypt. Not only was the guard down, the defense, our diplomacy was down, and there has never been a plan organized by Netanyahu on the development of Gaza. He's had no long-term interest in seeing that survive. And then during that period of time in September, Mr. Netanyahu had tens of thousands of people protesting him in the streets. So, brothers and sisters, we have a lot of people in Israel that agree with us. We want to put the hostages, the captive and the captors on the same page. Return each other's citizens. Let the hostages be free. Let those that are arrested without charges be free. Return people's families to one another. I'm going to craft another letter. I'm going to work with Mr. Jim Zogby to get some better language. I follow his leadership, and I'll hear from my constituents and friends that are here in the community on further actions that they want me to take. I'm their representative, and I'll do as they ask.
Congressman Jonathon Jackson. Quick shout out to the brilliant organizer, Alan Minsky from Progressive Democrats of America, who's out there, and who I suspect is ready to take that letter, not just around Washington, but take it out to districts across this country. I know that Ariel will do the same. And brothers and sisters, thank you so much for being there. You bring the strength to a panel like this. These people are active on the issues, but they need you. And your presence here, both through video and also in the room, that's what makes the difference. So please join me in a huge round of applause for yourselves and also for James Zogby, for Ariel Gold, and for Congressman Jonathon Jackson. Thank you.